basically saying that any rebuild in Sumner would now need to be at 12.83 metre datum level, or?
What we're saying is that, what I'm saying here is that there's not a big difference between what we've got in the operative plan for Sumner than what we've got in the draft plan that we're proposing now for Sumner. So we're just looking at different parts of this plan.
Oh yeah, there's only a few dots that appear in the for the extra half a metre.
If you look at the extra half metre issue, if you go back to the map I gave you with the light blue and the dark blue, if you look at the Sumner bit, there is a few dots of dark blue for Sumner. So if we adopted 1 metre, there'll be some additional areas in Sumner. Okay. Okay. So if we move on to the issues, as we've already talked about sea level rise, so we'll move on from that. Another important issue that came up was intensification in areas, if the areas in the FMA, whether it was appropriate to intensify in FMAs. Another issue that was considered...
Do people know that FMA is the flood management area? That's fine. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I think that some people, the concern about intensification in flood management area is twofold. How does the infrastructure cope, but also is it sensible to increase development in an area that's going to flood more? So there was quite a lot of issues in the public submissions on that. The second point that I've got there is concern about the effect of minimum floor level requirements on the recession plains, and I think we briefly touched that at the residential chapter on Friday. We've got some rules that provide at the moment in the draft plan an exclusion that if you're raising your floor levels to comply with these minimum floor levels in the FMA, that you'd be exempt from the recession plain rules. So you'd preserve what you could do at the lower level, and when you raise yourself up, you can still do that envelope of development, but no more. You couldn't just suddenly go really high. But what you had there in the envelope would be preserved at the higher level. There is an impact of that on neighbours, particularly if that neighbour stays at the lower level. So that's an issue that, obviously we would like some debate on, if there is any debate to be had.
So effectively, the envelope of house that you were allowed previously is still allowed, but it's allowed on a higher platform.
Yep.
Yeah. So the people who are down, who are getting their light blocked out are going to be not so thrilled.
Now, the thing about that at the moment, the way the draft plan proposes that, is it's for those areas that I showed you that were dotted. So it's the areas that it's already permitted to put up your minimum floor levels. So it's basically saying you're allowed to put it up as permitted activity, and we're not going to look at the recession plain issue. If you're in the restricted area like Sumner, that we haven't yet got an exclusion for people who are in there. So when they go for the restricted discretionary consent to raise their floor levels, the council gives them their minimum floor level, but we'll also look at the effect it would have on the neighbours. But the reasonable assumption is that we would be looking at that generously rather than making it difficult for them to raise their floor levels.
Just a quick question. So that applies to the intrusion values as well. So when your house goes up, you're actually now looking back over, and there are setbacks for intrusion.
Is maintained. So you still have to comply with your setbacks, you still have to comply with your maximum heights, so they're not affected by this rule. What's affected is the envelope that you can develop within. So you can't move your house closer without going through a resource consent.
But you're quite right, there are potentially impacts on the neighbours.
Yep.
How much in general will people actually have to raise their houses from where they are at the moment?
Hand on that, Graham.
Well, houses will only get raised when they're being rebuilt.
But take a street in Sumner, for example. Yeah. Somebody goes to rebuild.
In Sumner, probably is not going to be hit as much as South Shore, for example.
But just give me an example.
So a metre, let's say we're going up a metre.
That's Pleasant Community Centre. That's the levels that we're going to have to comply with.
Yes, okay. Okay. Half a metre sea level rise, finished floor level 11.82. 1 metre sea level rise, finished floor level 12.8. So that's gone up a half a metre. But Sumner is a little bit higher above the sea than South Shore. You've already got places in South Shore which are almost at the high tide level. As
Some
we
are
speak.
below, I think.
So, you know, you would see them going up a metre easily.
So there is a likelihood that you would have a street where houses would be at varying levels, and that's the reality. And that's the only way we can see at this stage to have an effect on newly built or repaired housing.
Has there been any consideration, because obviously raising a house up a metre, as you say, has a difference on the envelope. Someone putting back a high-pitched roof would certainly have an effect on that, and there are design or ways you can design around that impact of the high-low. Has there been any thought given to that?
Yeah, we have thought about that, because at the moment that's exactly what the resource consent planners do. They look at it on a site-by-site basis. They get, as a restricted discretionary activity, they get their minimum floor level, and then they also may trigger the recession plan rules, highly likely. And so then they talk to the neighbours and they have a discussion. If they were going to put back their pitched roof, there might be a discussion as to whether they're prepared to make it lower. There's debates, negotiations. At the moment, the process works where they might get resource consent for something a bit lower, but it's not a hard and fast process. Some people dip their toes in and say, you know, we want to rebuild what we had, and the neighbours don't get as much a look in. And other times the negotiation is much more successful, and the resource consent planners are able to get a better result, well, what they call a better result, because the neighbour's happier, and they've still got their raised floor levels plus their new building. So at the moment that could continue to occur in areas like Sumner where we haven't identified the fixed floor area, but in areas where we're offering this exemption, you're already giving them permitted activity status for the minimum floor level, so there's no resource consent there. So the idea is that they wouldn't then have to go for resource consent to breach the recession plans. So they're going hand in hand. At the same time, we're wary that there is an impact on the neighbours. But eventually that neighbour may be able to lift their floor levels as well, but they might not be able to. They might not be in a position to do that, or they might not be doing a rebuild. So there might be quite a substantial gap in time before that neighbour raises their floor levels up as well.
And this is another example of where the ministers, for example, want us to make life easier for people who are having to rebuild and wanting to mitigate effects of natural hazards versus community input, which is what Councillor Hanson wants to see more and more input on resource consent. So these are the balances that need to be considered all the time.
Thank you. When we're talking about raising floor levels, are we also talking about raising land levels on the section? And my point that I'm trying to get at, and it could be either or, is the stormwater runoff effect on neighbours who have not built up. And we see this already around areas in St Albans where we've got old properties and new properties have been built up, certainly not 1,200, but a little bit, and you do get low lying. So can you just clarify that, please?
This is a good question, more for the subdivision development chapter and fill requirements. We'll bring that. We'll make sure we answer that question when we bring that chapter to you.
When you're talking subdivisions, you're talking large developments. But when we're talking of this
The flood
raised floor levels, I'm talking about individual properties.
But they would have to, generally, depending on how much they want to increase the height of their property by, that they would need to meet certain standards for clean fill, certain levels for clean fill, and if it's over a certain amount, then they'll have to get a consent. So that's why I say it's in that chapter about how much increase you can make on your land.
We've also got rules on filling in the flood management areas as well. So there's a rule allowing permitted activity for your building platform. Anything more than that, you're into resource consent. So you can fill your land if it's part of raising your land for the minimum floor levels to be complied with. In terms of the building consent that would be required, that would deal with the stormwater and making sure that you didn't pass stormwater onto a neighbouring property. Right. It's built into that process, but you know, it's something that definitely has to be kept clearly in the consideration.
And we'll show you the rules for that when we get to that chapter.
Okay, because we want to look at what they're filling it with as well. Thanks.
Thank you. What are the notification kind of rules or guidelines around the raised floor levels, I've got constituents already complaining to me that it seems they've been on the receiving end, I think, of non-notified consent. So the new houses, Avondale, for instance, they're pushing through the recession plain, but they don't have any grounds on which to object.
Are they pushing through the recession plane as a result of raising floor levels, or they're just doing it?
Yes, as the result of raised floor levels.
So that's in the operative plan. There must be a rule in the operative plan that says it's a non-notification issue, if that's the case, because generally breaches of recession plane, it must... Alan, are you aware of there's a notification issue? Yeah, we'd have to check the plan, but I would have thought that the operative plan at the moment has that stipulation that it's a non-notified application.
If that's the case.
But
we'll come back to you on that.
my understanding was that the non-notification was something we were proposing in the draft plan.
Yeah.
I was of the impression myself that it could be limited notified to the neighbour.
Yeah.
That's what was said in the residential chapter, if you recall. Yes, if a house was to be lifted, for example, for any rebuild works or to clean out the liquefaction under the house or what have you, then it didn't require a resource consent and it wouldn't be notified.
Yeah.
If it's for permanently going through the building envelope, then it's likely it would be restricted discretionary, but I can recheck that and come back to you.
So,
Yeah, I would think if under the operative plan, restricted discretionary can be with or without notification as far as I'm aware.
We'll come back to you on
Yeah.
that.
okay,
So we'll check it.
thanks.
Yeah.
Look, thank you. I realise there's a crossover with the chapters, but just going back to Pauline's point too, when we come to this chapter on subdivisions too, could we also look at minimum areas of permeability of sections as part of flood prevention?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Some of that, of course, is already in the chapters that have been to you, commercial, residential, all of that kind of, those chapters, so that has been to you. Perhaps we can come up with a table for you or something like that.
On a completely unrelated issue, the only bit that we've passed so far that's leaving a worrying feel for me in terms of its lack of conformity with the rest of the plan, and it's nothing to do with this, but just when we look at the whole overview again, is the requirement for 2 cars to be on the section. Everything that we've done is about making walking and active transport easier, and that one seems to me to jar against the whole philosophy of the plan.
I think what you're talking about is one of the issues that was raised in the transport chapter, on-site parking requirements.
On-site parking requirements.
In particular with respect to medium density areas.
That's right, yes.
That's right. Well, the transport chapter, in what I said, we still need to go through. The revisions need to come back to you. Yeah. Okay.
Right, we'll carry on. So what do we, in terms of the recession plan discussion, have we basically
Covered that? You
covered that?
comfortable
And
with that one?
Comfortable with the exemption? That's where we got to. Yeah, okay, next one is
Clarification on Phil's point about the permeability of the land. Are we coming back to that? Did you say?
No,
Can we have
well,
input?
in the chapters that have been to you for particular zones, the commercial, industrial, residential zones, there have been permeability standards in there. So hopefully you've made it known to us where you're happy or not happy with them. Now, all of those 3, fortunately, still have to come back to you for final sort of sign-off of the revisions based on your comments. So if you raise that again when they come back to you, then we can make sure we take you to them.
That'd be good. Yes.
That's right. But do recall that those standards are in each of those chapters. So when we bring them back to you, ask us that question again and we'll take you to what it says.
Okay, thank you. That's great.
the next slide.
Yes, please.
Okay, I just put up there one of the issues that's come up in the public submissions is the effect of existing use rights, and that issue has been a concern for some, but a saving grace for others. So some people rely on existing use rights and they're very happy that they've got it, and then in terms of dealing with their insurance company, some some members of the public were not happy about the fact that insurance companies would rely on existing use rights and not do the right thing and raise the floor levels up. So that came through in the submissions. Existing use rights is a right under the RMA, so there's not a lot we can do about that. And how the insurance companies interpret that and deal with their customers is not something we can do a lot about.
So I've asked Janice to put these issues up. These are the significant issues that come through. They're not always related to what we can do in the district plan.
Yeah.
Well, existing use rights, I can ask Brent to comment on this. As Janice has said, it is a right under the Resource Management Act. It's a legal right that people have, and how insurance companies use those rights and interpret them is up to them. It's nothing that we can have an effect on through the district
And the
plan.
political side of me says use, because they know full well. So they use those rights to get out of, and here I'm being political, but they use it to get out of, you know, fair and reasonable payment on rebuild, because they know they can do it, rather than ensuring homeowners can lift their houses. But they have no interest in that, because essentially they're bookkeepers, so that's their role, to minimise the payout, not to... Anyway, I'm getting on
Yeah, it was just raising the issue that it's you know, it's a keen issue out there. Yeah. The other issues I've raised there, addition of support structures for overhead transmission lines to permitted activity status list. We'd actually not included them, and Transpower. Volume, yeah. In terms of issues, we have made an amendment in the plan in red in the chapter 5.8.1. We've added a permitted activity status for overhead transmission lines, and we've done that because Transpower have requested it. And the support structures aren't something that are going to impede much water, and they don't really need to be built to the minimum floor level. So that seems a reasonable request. We've also had discussions and a submission from Orion about their smaller structures and utilities and whether they should also get some permitted activity status in the FMAs. We haven't resolved that with them yet. We thought the building, definition of building, would allow them to do their little kiosks without the flood management rules affecting them, but they may have some smaller kiosks that are beyond the building definition of building. So we need to clarify that with them and see if there's something that we don't understand from their submission. And so that's the two areas in terms of utilities that we have to really make sure that we're working with. There's a phase 2 chapter looking at utilities, but this is going in at phase 1, so we need to almost preempt what we're going to put in the utilities chapter in phase 2 to deal with this issue in the natural hazards chapter. So we've got a little bit of quick work to do on that. And the last issue that I've raised there is concern about physical infrastructure works, given the capacity of our rivers have actually decreased, and that submission issue came up quite a lot, to wanting council to do works to increase the capacity of rivers. But again, that's not something that is part of the district plan process, and it's the operational side of the council.
And that's the sort of work that I believe will come through in the report to come to you shortly from the task force.
And then the last issue that I mentioned.
Question.
Can I just clarify that? Because, look, I accept your statement, but I know that there's some areas around the Upper Heathcote particularly, say the Cashmere Stream, where people's sections go right to the river. And in terms of ownership, sometimes that's debatable, and as to who owns the land. And I'm just wondering, is there anything we can put in our plan to clarify sort of ownership of that sort of, is it called a riparian strip or whatever it is?
Ownership. That sounds legal to me.
That's
The district plan can't say anything about ownership. Ownership's determined by other law, not by the RMA. But the RMA can require, for example, esplanade strips or esplanade reserves as part of the consent, as the RMA decision-making process for subdivisions, and I think for land use as well. Janice might have a better idea on this. Can require esplanade reserves and esplanade strips as part of the resource consent process.
So if as a council we wanted to build, say, for example, some stopbacks along the Heathcote, and there might be some areas we would have to use the RMA, is that what you're saying?
If the council's looking at putting in mitigation works on what's currently private land, what the council would want to do is act as either as a requiring authority and designate private land for that purpose, and then pay for it at market value, or use the Public Works Act, because we are talking about public works in those circumstances.
But I think more the issue was, I just wanted to highlight to you a district plan policy issue versus something operationally based, which might be dealt with through the Mayor's task force on flooding, and for example, dredging of rivers might be one of them. It's not something we would put in the district plan. Is the last issue?
That is the last issue, is insurance issues, and we've sort of already discussed that a little bit, but in a lot of the submissions were around the implications of raising floor levels in FMAs and the insurance issues around that. So some of them, there's not a lot that we can do about that because it's generally outside the district plan, but we have to acknowledge that there is a huge effect on people by showing these flood management areas on the district plan, because then the information is available and insurance companies and other people can use that information. In terms of the submissions that we've got, some of them mentioned that their insurance costs would be increased if they were identified as being in an FMA. That's it.
Just one more comment I would make before we finish the flooding part of the natural hazards chapter, is that there's been a lot of feedback from the community as these officers have gone out for public meetings and various smaller meetings in different communities. While they don't like what's coming in the plan and they don't like the aspect of possibly being in an FMA, there's generally been applause for the level of time and effort given to helping explain these rules and how they will work and into the future, and generally to clapping at the end of these meetings. So there is a view that they want some certainty around these matters out there as far as the district plan review goes.